I got to talking and lost track of time, blaming on Reuben and Rozio. It's their fault. We're moving right along in our survey, and we're looking at the divided kingdom today. And whenever you have the title divided kingdom, what does that imply? There was a united kingdom. And we talked about that a little bit last week. Didn't quite get to Solomon. But who are the kings of the united kingdom? There are only three of them. Saul, David, Solomon. How many years did they reign? Each one reigned 40 years, which means that the united kingdom lasted 120 years total. What happened when Solomon died? The kingdom split. Now, there are two kings. There's the first king of the northern kingdom of Israel, and then there's the first king of the southern kingdom of Judah after they split. And what were their names? Rehoboam and Jeroboam. Just our luck. Those are going to be hard for us to remember. Jeroboam and Rehoboam. And this is how I remember. S is Solomon. Well, what's the letter right before that? A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H. So R and S are right there next to each other. They go together. Rehoboam is the son of Solomon. What about Jeroboam? He's the other guy. He's the king of the northern kingdom of Israel. And so when you start thinking about these kings, I hope you just don't even have to stop and think about it. Rehoboam is the son of Solomon, and Jeroboam is not. He was actually Solomon's head general there for a time, but fell out of favor, and that's something we'll try to get to this morning. All right, can you read that list of kings? You don't need it. You got to memorize. Shane, start rattling off the names of all the kings of the southern kingdom of Judah. Go. Yeah. So David, Solomon, Rehoboam, Abijam, Asa, Jehoshaphat, and so on and so forth. We know those names. We're familiar with them for several reasons. But to be able to recite them, I don't think we have to learn the names of the kings. Don't necessarily have to learn the dates. What I do want us to know as we go through the divided kingdom very quickly today is that all of these kings of Judah, all the kings of Judah, are direct descendants of whom? David. That was supposed to be an easy question. This is David's dynasty. All of these men are related to David. There is a queen, though, who is not. And what was her name? Athaliah. Do you remember that? Athaliah. What about these fellas? The kings of the northern kingdom. There are 20 kings of the divided kingdom for each kingdom, roughly. 20 kings. How many of the kings for the northern kingdom of Israel, how many of them are related to David? There's some intermarrying between the lines around Ahaziah and Jehoram. So but for the most part, they're not related. They're not related. With David, there's a continual succession, sons, grandsons. With the northern kingdom of Israel, there are some coups, and some people who aren't related to each other end up killing each other. So we'll try to touch on some of that a little bit. I'm going to look at some passages here. The first one is in 1 Kings chapter 11, where we're going to quickly read about Solomon being told his kingdom is going to be taken away from him. 1 Kings chapter 11 describes Solomon's turning away from the Lord. And what is it that ultimately turned him away? What was the main factor? His wives? Did you say wives as in plural? Yes. He had 700 wives and 300 concubines. He was in a real sticky situation, that man was. And you can see that there in verse number 3. When you drop down to verse 11, verse 9, the Lord was angry with Solomon because his heart had turned away from the Lord, the God of Israel, who had appeared to him twice. The Lord had appeared to him twice, which we didn't talk about last week because we ran out of time. But you remember the first time God asked him, hey, Solomon, what do you want? You're about to become king. You're king now. What would you like from me? And what did Solomon ask for? Wisdom. What could he have asked for? Riches or the death of all of his enemies, something like that. And God said, because you didn't ask for those, but instead asked for wisdom, I'm going to give you all that too. And this was the golden age of Israel. And it's said that silver was as common as stones. I mean, they just had so much. The economy of Israel was magnificent during the days of Solomon. Well, that's going to come to a screeching halt here. And so here's 1 Kings 11, verse 11. Therefore the Lord said to Solomon, since this has been your practice and you have not kept my covenant and my statutes that I have commanded you, I will surely tear the kingdom from you and will give it to your servant. Does that sound a little familiar? This idea of tearing the kingdom and giving it to someone else? We saw this already in the case of Saul, who was told by Samuel, the Lord has torn the kingdom of Israel from you this day and has given it, and here he says, to your neighbor who is better than you. In both cases, it's not named specifically, but Solomon knows who it is. It's his former general, Jeroboam, who has fled to Egypt. And remember that, Jeroboam fled to Egypt while he was trying to get away from Solomon. Are Saul and Solomon related to each other? You got that Saul, Solomon? No, their names sound a little similar to each other. David and Saul are not related to each other. How many kings served as part of the dynasty of Saul? Well, one, just Saul, and he was rejected. David, Solomon, Rehoboam, all the way down to Jeconiah, his line will continue for hundreds of years. What had God promised David? How long would his dynasty last? What had God told him? I want your dynasty, David, to last forever, in perpetuity. But there was a condition. And what was that condition? In 2 Samuel 7. They have to obey. They have to obey. They have to keep the covenant. What is it that God condemns Solomon for? Verse 11, you have not kept my covenant. Now wait a minute. Solomon's the man who built the temple. And yet God is angry with him, displeased with him. What does this show us? We can be very zealous for the Lord and do a lot of great things for him. But does that guarantee he's going to be pleased with us? What have you done lately? And what he had done lately is turned from the Lord. And the kingdom was torn from him. Yes, ma'am. All right, it shows us that we can fall from grace. The great King Solomon fell from grace? Sure sounds like it. This is most unfortunate for the kingdom, because what you're now going to have is a divided kingdom. Now, I've got on the screen here, I've got the United Kingdom, and it's got all these pretty colors going on. You've got Israel in the north during the days of the divided kingdom. So let me go back here a second. There's the United Kingdom, where everybody's happy and everybody's united together. Do you see the brown tribe of Judah and Jerusalem's toward the north there? The idea was that the capital city that David established 7 years into his reign, the capital city was to be somewhat centralized, but still in Judah, the tribe of Judah. Why was David partial to the tribe of Judah? Because he was of the tribe of Judah. Now, To the south of Judah, inside of Judah, it's not showing on the map, that's where the tribe of Simeon is. And the tribe of Simeon over time is going to kind of get swallowed up by Judah. It's around where Beersheba is, but it's not shown on the map. Do you see also the tribes that are on the other side of the Jordan? You got these three tribes here, the half tribe of Manasseh, Dan and Reuben. You got those tribes right there on the other side of the Jordan. That's something to keep in mind. But it's not real pertinent to what we're going to be looking at this morning. So here is the divided kingdom. And something that you hear a lot in the text is references to Dan and Beersheba. And we even saw it earlier in 1 Samuel 3. We saw it last week when it was talking about the fame about Samuel, how everybody knew about Samuel from Dan to Beersheba. And what that is saying is from the north to the south, or Dan and Bethel. I got Beersheba in my head. Dan and Bethel, excuse me. So Dan's in the north, Bethel is in the south of Israel, not Judah. Dan to Bethel, from north to south. Everybody knows about the kingdom here. Everybody in the kingdom knows about Samuel earlier. And this helps to set off the kingdom from Dan way up in the north, not the tribe of Dan, but Dan, this city, all the way down to Bethel. Jeroboam, who picked Jeroboam to be the king of the northern kingdom of Israel? God did. Well, wait a minute. I thought Jeroboam wasn't descended from David. Well, he wasn't. God is the one who picked Jeroboam to be his king for the 10 tribes. The two royal tribes, Judah and Benjamin. Benjamin's right north of Judah. And those two tribes, even though they didn't necessarily get along, they make up the tribes of the southern kingdom. Benjamin is a royal tribe. What do I mean by that? What tribe was Saul from? Benjamin. And that makes it a royal tribe. Now, Saul's not the king anymore. But how do a lot of people, especially those related to Saul, how do they feel about Saul, who's dead? How do they feel about David, who's alive and reigning? Are there some hard feelings? There are a lot of hard feelings. And yet God predicts and decrees it's going to be these two tribes. But there's constant conflict. Why? Why did the tribes split off? Why weren't they happy? It's because, yes, ma'am. Go ahead. Okay. So Rehoboam got some advice, and you can read about that here in 1 Kings. And the advice was to continue the taxation, the heavy taxation, in fact, make it worse than his dad. What was it all of a sudden, after Solomon died, that's when the hard feelings began? No. David, yes, he's the king of all 12 tribes, but he favored Judah. And that's where everybody came from. All the servants came down to Judah. Judah became prominent. It's the dominant tribe. And Solomon continued that. I mean, he's got to build the temple. He's got to build his palace. It took 7 years to build the temple. It took even longer to build Solomon's house. Did you have a hand? Hey, all right. When your leader is a human being, you're going to have problems. All right, and that's what they were supposed to do. But even then, during the days of the judges, we saw when God was their king, and that's what he should be, they still were disobedient. You've got to adhere to the law of Moses, to God's law, put it that way. Speaking of adhering to God's law, and I know we're hurrying, I know we're rushing through a lot of this, but I hope these are some important details that will assist you. Jeroboam, when he became king, had God's blessing. What God wanted Jeroboam to do was have a wonderful kingdom. And Jeroboam didn't. And here's why. He didn't have trust in the Lord. God's the one who appointed him. Now, there are some political machinations that take place where the people don't realize it's God who's behind it all, but Jeroboam did. And under the Mosaic law, the Feast of Tabernacles is singled out here. Under the Mosaic law, where was the Feast of Tabernacles supposed to be celebrated? Every year in Jerusalem. When? On the 7th month and the 15th day of the month. Well, Jeroboam says, you know what? If everybody in the northern kingdom starts going down for the feasts, for the festivals, if they start going down to the southern kingdom of Judah, they'll go, why are we divided? We're all brothers. We should cut this out. And so what does What does Jeroboam, the king of the northern kingdom, what does he decide to do? He's going to set up his own priesthood. He's going to set up his own festival day. Instead of being on the 7th month, the 15th day, it's now going to be the 8th month. And it's not going to be in Jerusalem, where the temple is. It's going to be in Dan, the northern point of Israel, and Bethel, the southern point of Israel. And that's what's going to happen here. Is God pleased with this? God say, that is so innovative of you, Jeroboam. What should Jeroboam have done? Let his people continue to worship in Jerusalem, even though that was now, in essence, a separate nation. It was, but it wasn't. Should Jeroboam have let his people go down there? That's what God decreed. That was the law. In order to do that, though, that means he would have to trust that they'd come back. He'd have to trust the Lord, that the Lord would continue to bless him. And Jeroboam did not have that kind of trust. In fact, what is it that they worshiped? Now, they said these idols, he set up some idols in Dan and Bethel so that people in the north could go up to Dan, people in the southern part of the northern kingdom could go down to Bethel, not have to travel too far. What did Jeroboam set up in Dan and Bethel? Golden cows. Have we seen that before in Israelite history? Yes. In Deuteronomy, Exodus 32 through 34. When Moses ascends to Mount Sinai, and they start doubting about Moses and all this, and they turn to Aaron, Moses' brother, and they say, we don't know what's happened to this Moses fella. Make for us gods that we may worship. And they craft a golden calf. Well, now there's two of them. And I asked you a little while ago, where had Jeroboam fled to when Solomon was after him before he became king? Egypt. Where did he learn about golden calves? Egypt. Where do we learn about golden calves? When we leave the Lord and we go to Egypt. There's a lesson there. There's a sermon there. Don't preach it, Shane. Don't steal it from me, okay? So take a look with me here in 1 Kings 12. 1 Kings 12, verses 28 and 29. I guess I should back up. Verse 26. Just read it for what Jeroboam wants to say about his own situation. Jeroboam said in his heart, he's talking to himself here, now the kingdom will turn back to the house of David. If this people go up to offer sacrifices in the temple of the Lord at Jerusalem, then the heart of this people will turn again to their Lord, to Rehoboam, king of Judah. And they'll kill me and return to Rehoboam, king of Judah. Was that true? Would that have happened? Why not? Because God would have protected him. He didn't trust God. He said, this is what I'm going to do. Verse 28, the king took counsel and made 2 calves of gold. And he said to the people, you have gone up to Jerusalem long enough. Behold your gods of Israel, who brought you up out of the land of Egypt. And that sounds just like what Aaron said back in Exodus 32. Here are your gods. Here is your God. Where do they learn about worshiping cows? In Egypt, because they worship pretty much everything. Why cows? That's a good question. Why cows? Another question. Why did the Egyptians worship cats? I mean, they worshipped everything. Can you imagine even having a cat in your house? And like, oh, never mind. Let's keep going here. Later, as you see the different kings talked about in the book, references to these golden cows will be made over and over again. Here's one of them. 2 Kings 10, verse 29, talking about Jehu. I mean, we're a couple hundred years down the road now, and they're still talking about these golden calves that were set up around the 930s BC. Jehu, he's one of the kings of the northern kingdom. Jehu did not turn aside from the sins of Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, which he made Israel to sin. That is, the golden calves that were in Bethel and in Dan. Jeroboam has just set something up that is so awful, so horrible, and it is going to affect the nation of Israel, the northern kingdom of Israel, throughout its existence. And it only exists for a couple hundred years. So right now we've talked about 2 kings. I've highlighted them on the screen. I know it's hard to see. I just want you to get the impression of how many kings there are. You've got Jeroboam and dropping down to Jehu there. 1 Kings 13, verse 33. Here is the end of the reign of Rehoboam. I think I've got it on the screen here. There it is. Verses 33 and 34 of 1 Kings 13, the last 2 verses. This thing, Jeroboam did not, after this thing, Jeroboam did not turn from his evil way, but made priests from the high places again from among the people, not from among the Levites. Any who would, he ordained to be priests of the high places. And this thing became sin to the house of Jeroboam, so as to cut it off and to destroy it from the face of the earth. What is this thing that I've highlighted on the screen 3 times? What is it? The disobedience, the making of the calves, the changing of the when the feasts are celebrated, the priesthood. What he just really messed up. And there's a lot we're skimming over, but there's prophecies trying to get Jeroboam to wake up, but he doesn't listen. He doesn't acknowledge it. And I do hope down the road we will be able to study 1st and 2nd Kings. It may be a while before we get to it, and I'll try to remember some of these things. As you go deeper into Kings, in 2 Kings, I'll just read this for you. If you want to read it or turn to it, you can. But it's talking about another one of the kings, Pekahiah, the son of Menachem, began to reign over Israel in Samaria, and he reigned 2 years. He did what was evil in the sight of the Lord. Listen to this. He did not turn away from the sins of Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, which he made Israel to sin. And we are a couple hundred years down the road, and we're very close to the end of the northern kingdom of Israel. So let me show you all the kings again. There's Pekahiah highlighted there in the bottom right. However, those are the kings of the northern kingdom who are constantly compared to Jeroboam. Jeroboam, the first king of the northern kingdom, everybody is always compared to him. How many of the 20 rulers of the northern kingdom of Israel, how many of them obeyed the Lord? How many of them were good? I see a goose egg back there. None. You ever asked that on Bible trivia? You got the answer. How many kings of the southern kingdom of Judah, direct descendants of David, how many of them were good? Oh, you got an answer. How many? 8. Okay. 8. And so it's not as easy as an answer there. But who are the kings of the southern kingdom always compared to? David. Take a look at these smattering of verses here. 1 Kings 15, verse 11. Talking about Asa, Rehoboam, Abijam, Asa. So the third king of the divided kingdom of Judah. Asa did what was right in the eyes of the Lord, as David his father had done. Ding, there's one of them, Asa. I'm not going to go through all of them. 2 Kings 14, verse 3, Amaziah did what was right in the eyes of the Lord. All right, good for Amaziah, otherwise known as Uzziah. Yet not like David his father. He did in all things as Joash his father had done. What happened to Uzziah at the end of his life? Or I guess it wasn't the end of his life, but there was a point in time he became a leper. God struck him with leprosy. So does that tell you something about Uzziah? He wasn't all he was, and this is what this description is trying to get us to. Josiah, the last good king, Josiah did what was right in the eyes of the Lord. 2 Kings 22, verse 2, walked in the way of David his father, in all the way of David his father. Listen to this. He did not turn aside to the right or to the left. Who was admonished by the Lord himself not to deviate to the right or to the left? A couple weeks ago, we talked about Joshua. You remember that? Where he said, be strong and courageous and obey the law of Moses, the law of the Lord, and do not deviate to the right or to the left. As we study these books, I want to emphasize Joshua, Judges, 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, those books go together. Now, we lump them all as books of history, along with Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther, and Ruth. But the way that the Old Testament was arranged originally, Joshua, Judges, Samuel, Kings all went together. And there are numerous connections between these books. And this is one of them, referring all the way back to Joshua chapter 1. And you've got near the end of 2 Kings references to Joshua in Josiah. All right, I'm not going to spend a lot of time looking at this with you, but I think this is cute. These are charts that our kids have. And you can see there, the kingdom divides. You got the divided kingdom, and it's even got some dates on there. And so you see in the, up top in the north are the kings of the northern kingdom. And then in the south, and see how they're spaced? See how they're spaced out? And so Asa reigns 41 years. That's why they're spaced out like that. And so this is helpful, a chart like this. Here's something else about it. If you're a bad king, you look like this. If you're a good king, you look like this. And there aren't very many happy faces. Rehoboam, Abijam, Asa. Which of those three guys is the only good king? Asa. And Asa was, we read it just a moment ago, he was declared to be a good king, like David. Rehoboam, his son Abijam, his son Asa. What happened? Why was Asa good when his dad and granddad were bad? Turn back to the Lord. Are you guaranteed to have a good child, an obedient child who loves the Lord, just because you love the Lord? No. And the opposite also is not true. If you're a reprobate, it doesn't mean your children are doomed that way. And there's a whole lesson there as well. As the chart continues, you can't see very well, but all those fellows in the north are bad. They're all frowning. And then here in the south, you've got a few that are smiling, and we're moving along here through the chart. And then eventually, whoa, what happens here? How come the north line doesn't continue? Because the southern kingdom was prolonged longer than the northern kingdom. And on this chart, it's got a date of 722. And that's when Assyria, not Syria, but Assyria, defeated the northern kingdom of Israel, made them a vassal nation, and deported them, scattered them all throughout the Assyrian Empire. And you hear the phrase, the lost 10 tribes of Israel. That's basically what it's describing. They lost their tribal identity. Why? Why did this happen? I thought God handpicked Jeroboam. I thought God blessed Jeroboam and said, you're going to be a great king if you obey me and everything's going to be wonderful. What happened? They all had sad faces. Every one of those kings were unfaithful. And God gave them time. He gave them a couple hundred years. So 931 to 722 is the time period of the northern kingdom of Israel. And Omri, who was the father of Ahab, he made Samaria, he made that city his capital. And thus, the people who remained after most of Israel was deported, the people that remained, they became known as the Samaritans. The Samaritans. So when the Assyrians defeated the northern kingdom of Israel, deported most of the nation everywhere, they left the poor behind. But then what would they do to the other nations that they had defeated? They were scattering them. They were deporting them, and many of them ended up in the northern kingdom of Israel, and they intermarried with these Israelites, and they brought their own religions with them. So you've got some people, the Samaritans, who want to obey the Lord, but then you got all these other people that they're intermarrying with now because they live there. And eventually you have a whole new half-breed nation of Jews. And that's where the Samaritans come from. That's not true of the southern kingdom. The southern kingdom does continue for a while, but eventually they also will be defeated. And by the way, who is the king in the days of the northern kingdom being defeated? Who was the king of the southern kingdom at the time? Good King Hezekiah. And did Assyria, after destroying the northern kingdom of Israel, and I know we're going quickly, I hope you remember some of this if this is unfamiliar to you. Do you remember when Assyria defeated the northern kingdom, did they just go back home and say, all right, we're going to leave Judah alone? No, they came knocking. They came knocking on the door and were going to defeat the southern kingdom right then and there. But what did Hezekiah do? He prayed. He prayed to the Lord. Sennacherib had sent his emissary and given a letter to Hezekiah. And what did Hezekiah do with that letter, where the letter saying, I'm going to beat you up. I'm going to defeat you guys. What did Hezekiah do with that letter? Say it louder. All right. He talked to a prophet of God. And where did he take that letter? Where did Hezekiah, good King Hezekiah, took that letter to? The temple, and laid it out before the Lord and said, I'm leaving this in your hands. There's a great lesson right there. Good King Hezekiah. How many kings in the northern kingdom were good? 0. They didn't stand a chance. And yet God let them exist for 200 years. What was God hoping would happen in the northern kingdom? That somebody would repent. Some leader would help them to repent. All right. This is a survey, so we're not trying to get too bogged down in details, but I'll point out to you that there are various sections here. 1 Kings 1 through 11 is about Solomon and the kingdom dividing. And then you've got different sections. We really don't have time to talk about these sections except to look at them in this way. You've got a whole bunch of kings listed here. Jeroboam, Nadab, Baasha, Elah, those are all kings of the northern kingdom. and you can see how they are talked about successively. There'll be a total of about 20 kings of the northern kingdom. Interspersed between their stories are discussions about the southern kingdom. So that's how it's done here. You talk about the northern kingdom a little bit, and then you switch and change gears and start talking about kings of the southern kingdom. And I've highlighted, as we walk through this very quickly, I've highlighted in yellow the kings of the southern kingdom. So as we continue now and move on to the second section, oh yeah, I should have pointed this out. The first section starts with Jeroboam, of course, and Rehoboam, and ends with Ahab. Is Ahab an important person for us to talk about? And who was the prophet that was a thorn in Ahab's side? Well, the prophet of the Lord, Elijah. Yeah, Ahab and Jezebel. So moving on to the second section, starting in 1 Kings 17. What happens in 1 Kings 18? I want us to memorize this. 1 Kings 18 is the battle on Mount Carmel. 1 Kings 19 is when Elijah flees and God has to go to him and say, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" And the narrative slows down at this point and spends a lot of time talking about Ahab. So when the first major section talked about Rehoboam to Ahab, and then it picks up with Ahab and spends a lot of time talking about Ahab and his interaction with Elijah. Jehoshaphat and Ahab. Tell me about them. God did not want the kings of Judah to interact with and intermarry with the kings of the northern kingdom. But you remember Jehoshaphat did, to his detriment, because Jehoshaphat is going to have his son marry into Ahab and Jezebel's family, and Ahab and Jezebel are going to have a daughter who seizes the throne in the southern kingdom, Athaliah. And how does she do that? How does Athaliah seize the throne? She kills Jehoshaphat's great-grandchildren, except one. And who was that? Joash. All right. And so there's Joash listed. Jehoram and Ahaziah were brothers. And so there's some of these guys, and there's some overlap with names. And that's another reason why I'm mad at Jehoshaphat, because if he hadn't intermarried, you wouldn't have all these same names. So there's a king of Jehoram in the north, and there's a king of Jehoram in the south at the same time. That just messes everything up. And then there's a king of Ahaziah in the north and a king of Ahaziah in the south. Jehoshaphat's fault. But I like that name, though, Jehoshaphat. That's a good name. Should have named one of our kids Jehoshaphat. You see all the interspersing going on. And the third major section of Kings ends with the fall of Israel. So we're not really talking about these kings. I'm just showing you the structure. And the book, the big picture, it does talk about the structure. And it would be good to just read these various sections one at a time and see how they all go together, those sections, and talk about these various kings. This third major section, the next to last, ends with the fall of Israel. And I want you to take a look at that with me. 2 Kings 17. 2 Kings 17. The fall of Israel. Elijah, did he mess with the southern kingdom? Was he talking to the kings of the southern kingdom? No, he was trying to get Israel, the northern kingdom, to repent. The great prophet Elisha tried to get the northern kingdom to repent, but they did not. And eventually God says, I've had enough. What does that tell you about God and his patience? One, that he is patient. He is patient with sin. He sends prophets to try to get them to repent. But what else does it tell you about God's patience? Yes, sir. It runs out, something James knows very well. All those spankings he got as a kid. Dad's patience runs out. All right. What you have is a detailed description of the evil of the southern kingdom. And You have God spelling out why he allowed the northern kingdom to be destroyed. That's 2 Kings 17, verse 7. This occurred because the people of Israel had sinned against the Lord their God, who had brought them up out of the land of Egypt from under the hand of Pharaoh, king of Egypt, and had feared other gods. If there's any doubt as to why the northern kingdom of Israel was defeated, we are told right here in 2 Kings 17 that it was because of idolatry. Now, what did the Assyrians think? Who did they think was responsible for the defeat of the northern kingdom of Israel? Themselves. But we're talking about the God of all the earth, the creator of the universe, and this is his covenant people. The only way the Assyrians could have defeated the northern kingdom of Israel is if God let them. And Isaiah talks about this, where he talks about Assyria as his battering ram, and the battering ram saying, I did this. No, the one who's wielding the battering ram. God punished the northern kingdom of Israel because of idolatry. And there's a big, long, detailed listing of all the reasons. 2 Kings 17, verses 7 through 23. There isn't a big, long description of Judah, and we need to get to the end here, so I'm going to keep going. As we're moving along now, there are no kings of the northern kingdom. They're all destroyed. So why do I have these guys highlighted? Hezekiah, Ammon, their stories are important. You have Josiah, who, and I've got the ages of these fellas. These are the last kings of the southern kingdom. Josiah, when he became king, he was 8 years old. Can you imagine Sammy being king of a nation? Because he's a little older than that. Imagine Kaylee being king. Because Will. Oh, okay, all right. There's not much age difference between Sammy and Kaylee, but they're still 12, 13, so they're older than Josiah. Josiah reigns 40 years though, and he has some really good qualities about him. You start looking at his sons. Jehoahaz. Jehoahaz was actually appointed by Nebuchadnezzar, because by this point, Nebuchadnezzar is in the process of defeating the northern kingdom. Look at these guys' ages. Jehoahaz, Jehoiakim, these guys are in their 20s. Jehoiakim, 18 years old. And then Zedekiah. Jehoiakim was very young. And we come to the end of our class. We come to the end of 1st and 2nd Kings. And this is what it says. There is a glimmer of hope. There's always a glimmer of hope. In the 37th year of the exile of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, in the 12th month, on the 27th day of the month, evil Merodach, he's the emperor of Babylon, king of Babylon, in the year that he began to reign, graciously freed Jehoiakim, king of Judah, from prison. Why does 2 Kings end with this little bit of good news? I mean, it's not much. He's still a prisoner, but he's allowed to eat at the king's table. Oh, this is horrible what has happened. God's people in Joshua enter the land, then they're kicked out of the land, but there's still a glimmer of hope. Why is that important to us? Because of Jesus. All those kings of David, including Jehoiakim, they're all related to David. What about Jesus? He is a direct descendant of David. And talking about Solomon, as for you, Solomon, you shall not lock a man on the throne of Israel. This is before 1 Kings 11. This is 1 Kings 9. Talking about Jehoiakim, Jeremiah the prophet said this. I'm having to hurry because we are out of time. A man shall not succeed in his days. Write this man down as childless. Jehoiakim, I mean, it's as if you have no more kids, because no one will be ruling on your throne. And then when we come to Matthew 1, Jeconiah is what he's called, but it's the same guy. Jehoiakim is talked about. Josiah, the father of Jeconiah, and his brothers, those are the guys that ruled after him, at the time of the deportation to Babylon. This is the New Testament. This is Matthew 1. Here is verse 12. And after the deportation to Babylon, the line continues from Jeconiah to Shealtiel to Zerubbabel, who was the governor of Jerusalem. And eventually, the line goes down to a guy named Jacob, who has a son named Joseph, who has an adoptive son named Jesus. Even though God punished the northern kingdom and they were dispersed, they were no more, did God completely eradicate the southern kingdom? No. And when he had them deported to Babylon, what had he promised them? That a remnant could return. And why did God do that? Because he was looking to Jesus. And we'll talk a little bit about that next week as we get into the exile and return. And the books that talk about that are Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther. So those are the three books we'll be looking at next week. Hope this is helpful. Hope this reminds us of this important Bible history. Thank you.